Welcome to room number one, session number 4. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Tamara Scheer. Dr. Scheer is an historian teaching at the University of Vienna, with the Institute for East European History. Dr. Scheer is specialized in diversity of religion, language, and nationality in the late Habsburg monarchy period. She is widely published. I looked up her CV, and she has over 8 pages of publications. Happily, I won't read you the list because I don't speak any German. In addition to teaching at the University of Vienna, Dr. Scheer has been in Rome at the Pontifical Institute of Santa Maria della Anima, where she's leading a project to identify Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war who are buried in Italy. The project's entitled Turning a Forgotten Burial Place of 450 Austro-Hungarian Soldiers from the First World War in Rome into a 21st Century Memorial. That needs an acronym, I think. Anyway, armed with this background, we will now have the pleasure of hearing Dr. Scheer tell us all about Austria-Hungary, how to lose a war in 12 languages. Over to you, Dr. Scheer.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. And as you said, how to lose the war in 12 languages is also how to lose the war within only 30 minutes. As you can see, we had some different technical issues today. So Giles is doing the PowerPoint slides, responsible for that. So please go for the next one. So it's a spoiler alert because I said something like how to lose the war in 12 languages. And what I'm really convinced of after writing a book on that and dealing with this topic for about 10 years, is like it was not that the language diversity was not the reason why they lost the war. And of course, it caused a lot of problems and additional challenges. Other so-called more homogeneous armies didn't have to struggle with, but it influenced it. And it influenced all army organization already before the First World War. So I tried to give you some overview and show you some images and sources I found in the archives in the past 10 years across former Austro-Hungarian lands. So I worked in today's Ukraine, Lviv. I worked in Sarajevo, for example, in the archives. So I just brought you some slides to get into that. If you're interested to read more about it, because I can never do that all of it in 30 minutes, I have put so the latest book was published in German, but it was based on my habilitation thesis. This is something bureaucratical at the university in Austria to be allowed to teach all courses and classes. But I wrote the habilitation thesis in English, and there is a link for that on the last slide. You can see where you can read this open access and free. You don't have to charge it. So ready for the tour de force. Next one, please. I will keep that really short. But what is really important to say is that there was not one armed force between 1867 and 1918 on Austro-Hungarian soil. Rather, there were 4 or even 5, however you call it. So my topic was like to deal with the so-called Austro-Hungarian or joint army. So it was based on common conscription, and it held garrisons and trained conscripts all over Austria-Hungary. And this is how you can distinguish it from the others, because there were also 2 or 3 territorial defenses who were based during peacetime only on the Austrian soil, on Hungarian soil, or for the example of the Croatian Domobransko within Hungary in the Croatian Slavonian part of it. So they were not responsible for all over Austria-Hungary and also not stationed there. As a force, you may include like the Navy. The Navy recruited from all over Austria-Hungary their sailors. But it was, of course, it was a navy, so they were not operating on land, although they had some facilities, of course, at the Adriatic Sea, like in Pula or in Dubrovnik. Next, please. So what is really important is that the Austro-Hungarian army, the one I'm dealing with, and the one with the 12 languages, or up to 12 languages, was deployed across the monarchy in peacetime. Or what I already said, you can use a different map like this one. So here, Austria and Hungary are not split, like according that's Austrian, that's Hungarian, that's Bosnia, but it was also split and had its military borders because the Austro-Hungarian army was split into so-called core commands. Next one, please. What's also really important is that there were lots of languages spoken, and as I always tell my students, never trust in statistics or maps. So also this here shows like there is a big red part which shows that there is German speakers, and where there is Bohemia written, it's in blue. But in fact, it's not like that. They were much more mixed. So this map is from 1911, so from Austro-Hungarian times, but usually they turned it like in blue or in red when there was like 51% of Czech speakers and 49 it turned blue. So it was much more mixed from the languages as it looks like here. Next one, please. What's really important when it comes to the organization of the language diversity is the Article 19 of the Austrian Constitution from 1867. This Article 19 says, like, it's a citizen right that all Austrian citizens have the right to use their language when they come into contact with state institutions, like in school or when they had to apply for a new passport or whatever. And it was also adopted for the Austro-Hungarian army that every conscript has the right to be trained and to use their language during military service. What is really important to say is, like, and it caused a lot of debates and troubles with Hungarian politicians, that they also applied this right on Hungarian soil, so when they trained Hungarian citizens for the Austro-Hungarian army, because the Hungarian constitution did not have such a right, like that they are allowed to use their language. The common conscription lasted for 3, and later it was reduced to 2 years. And what's really important when we deal with the language use of the Austro-Hungarian army is to mention that there were somehow 3 levels. So there was the command language, which was in German. Every conscript has to remember like 80 terms depending on which arms they were employed. Like it's at artillery or cavalry, they had different kind of commands, but it was about 80 commands. Every soldier had to learn in German language. Then you had something like, it was called the service language. That was the one like of internal correspondence. So for example, when the corps commander wrote to the ministry, to the war ministry, it had to be in German. So this was also German. But then there was this, and this was a new invention of 1868 when the army reform took place on the basis of the citizen right to use the languages. It was 11 to 12 regimental soldiers' languages, or soldiers' languages called. This is that they have the right. I will later come back to this. Why do I say 11 to 12? I mean, you can go through the languages I've shown on the map. So the important thing is that for a while they called Serbian and Croatian, and then they added a third, like Serbo-Croatian. So, and then you come from 11 to 12 languages. What is important to say is that not every conscript received the right to use this language, because there was a limitation of this language right from the very early on. So it had to be a recognized language at the place where he came from. For example, there was Bohemia, and Bohemia was officially bilingual, so it equally had to use the German and the Czech language. If now, for example, a Hungarian lived in Bohemia and was enlisted there, he had no right to use the Hungarian language. And the second limitation was that the language in a regiment had to reach 20% of speakers. So, for example, when there was only 19% of Czech speakers in this Bohemian regiment, it was solely German, or sometimes the other way around. What does this mean? In summer 1914, you had 142 regiments and battalions that were monolingual. What is really important, only 31 among them was German, so that you had solely Czech regiments too. And 162 used 2 languages or had to recognize 2 languages. And there were even some who used 3 and 4, which usually came from the Kingdom of Hungary. So what was the challenge? The challenge was to have at the right place, at the right time, a sufficient number of officers, and never to forget NCOs, who were able to speak these languages to these soldiers who they had to train there. So you had to really employ them in the right way. and also to take care that all the language requirements are implemented properly. And to avoid that, for example, out of nationalism, that bilingual speakers, for example, as for example, a conscript was Czech's native speaker, but also spoke German. It often happens that he was counted as a German out of national or out of convenience, and so put into a German training unit. This is really important. And so it was also the challenge that from the war ministry downwards, that they always took care that these rights were respected everywhere across Austria-Hungary. Next one, please. So I've said that now I come up with some sources I collected over the years. For example, German as the language of command meant there was many publications and handbooks for officers and NCOs how to train these command words, and I've brought here one. So they didn't have to remember very often the whole sentence, like look right, look left, advance, but they just had to remember one word, which was usually highlighted when they were training the soldiers. What is really important is that this so-called German language of command it was had a lot of terms which came from the French language, because in the military all over Europe, the French language was really important throughout the 18th century and the 19th too. And so ecstasy and party and homenage, all these came from French language. Next one, please. What is really important is how did the army know about the conscript languages? So when they had to show up for the medical examination and to be proven if they have to serve or not, they were asked which languages they speak and wrote. And what is really important is they were not asked for their native tongue, although then it had to be reported which the preferred language or the first language was. And so usually all these forms were often not filled out properly, because military bureaucrats wanted to ease their daily duty, and so they were very often they underlined one language then. What also often happened is that they used terminology that was not officially recognized language. Like you can see here, it's like Ladinish, which is spoken in South Tyrol and in today's Trentino, and it was mentioned here, or Bosnian, which was also not officially allowed, or just Slavonic to indicate, oh, the soldiers spoke something like a Slavic language. Next one, please. What is really important, as I said, it was they were never asked for their native tongue when they showed up for the medical examination. But what then happened is that this information was annually printed and then portrayed in a way that they belonged to a particular nationality. So as you can see here, it's from the statistical yearbook. You see from the nationality of the conscript, it's German, Czech, Slovak, Poles, but it's although they were not asked for. So it often, this information, for example, when they were bilingual and then they counted not the real native language, and then some Czech became a German in the statistic. And this is the reason, and this is what I did for 10 years research, it's like showing all these high figures of German or German speakers among officers and the conscripts. It's not right, because it hasn't been such a high number, but very often they just manipulated when they counted. And very many bilinguals were then counted and ended up as Germans in the statistics. Next one, please. Just one remark. I've always also included the source where I found this information, because it's really good, because in the past 5, 6 to 7 years, a lot of this material was digitized and is now available online. So I also included the link to that. An additional challenge was that there were so many dialects spoken, and I've brought you here an example from a General Staff Officer, August von Urbanski, about his Hungarian Transylvanian company, and he says Germans, Hungarians, Romanian Gypsies and Jews, and the Transylvanian Saxons idiom was difficult to understand, and the Jews spoke Yiddish. What does that mean? Even today, if you go into a small village in the Alpines, very often it's I hear them, I listen to them talking. I do not understand them when I'm from Vienna. And this also very often happened. Like some Hungarian officers spoke standard German perfectly, but then he had to train like some Tyroleans or people from other parts where they really spoke a strong dialect. Next one, please. So the officers were requested to learn a regiment's language upon deployment. They had 3 years to learn the language when they didn't speak it beforehand. What is also really important is that, like with the conscript, for a long time, statistics showed that the overwhelming bulk of Austro-Hungarian K&K army officers had been of German nationality, but also, as in the case for the soldiers, it happens that it's just very often if someone spoke German in another language or his first language was Hungarian, spoke also German because all officers had to know German, that he then ended up in the statistics as a German. The first one who took these figures critically was István Deák, and his book Beyond Nationalism, which I really highly recommend to read. He already went through all the personnel files of the officers, counted their language knowledge, and looked where they came from. And so he already downsized this 80%. Sometimes you see the statistic of 80% Germans among the officers to 55. But also he had to give in the numbers and the sheer fact that you very often cannot put them into one nationality group. And so he just invented a 16.2 category of mixed nationality. Next one, please. Here's just one really prominent example, and I was really happy that I had so many years of really focusing on research on that I've read so many memoirs, diaries, and letters that I sometimes came across one and the same officer portrayed in different memoirs of his former comrades. And one example is where this happened was Raimund Gerber or Gruber. So if you take a look into his personnel file, he was born in Ogulin. He was a Greek Oriental, which was Serbian Orthodox in Austrian bureaucratic, and he was the son of an officer. And this personnel file shows that he spoke German and Croatian perfectly, and Slovene and Czech sufficiently. So due to the counting, as I said before, you might have put him into a German nationality or assigned him a Croat nationality. But if you then go on with like his former comrade Eduard San Antoni wrote like Gerber was a Serb, and another comrade said he was a genuine Croat. So as you can see, very often these officers were not, even for the comrades, they were not assignable because they spoke many languages and they maybe had parents of mixed nationality. That very often happens for the sons of of men who were already also officers in the army. So it was very often not really, they were not assignable. Next one, please. So the officers had to learn the language of these recruits sufficient for service. So that was terminology used by the army bureaucracy. Sufficient for service meant that they had to teach the soldiers by themselves. No perfect grammar, but they had to be able to do that. Unfortunately, there were no standardized tests, language tests, which means very often you can see that these officers who tried to learn the language were either they didn't really spoke it, but they were just the other officers let them pass in the test because they said, well, he's otherwise a good officer. Or some people failed because other officers didn't like them or whatever. So, and it was really till until 1914 that there were no standardized tests. Next slide, please. So who then did the service in all the languages? It was usually the NCOs. While the officers usually came from a totally different region where the soldiers came from, they had to train. The NCOs were usually from the region. They spoke the languages of the conscripts. And so it was them who actually had to step in when the officers were unable to speak with the soldiers. Next one, please. So In peacetime, these challenges or failures due to the language diversity was more of a political debate or a political issue than it was for the ordinary soldier, because usually at least there was someone who helped out with the language if the soldier had something to say, or there was someone who explained him. I might skip a bit of this political debate. The only thing I would like to say is that also, although there were some really grievances based on that some soldiers, for example, were not able to express themselves and then were treated badly, that usually the parliamentarians in the Austrian parliament did not really support them. So they brought these grievances up, but usually immediately in the circumstances, they transformed this really practical issue into a political one. And so usually like the Slovene delegates spoke only for the Slovene soldiers and the Czech for the Czechs. And this made it relatively easy for the minister and for the army bureaucrats to say like, but there is nothing to change necessary because that's all nationalist. And this is what happened before 1914. And this is why the system was never really improved. Although the officers and the bureaucrats were very well aware, and you can read this in their diaries and memoirs, that the system did not work properly. Next one, please. So there was a different political debate in Hungary. So the Hungarian key sentences, why many Hungarian politicians resisted the overall system, was called the Magyar nyelv állam nyelves nem ezrednyelv, which means Hungarian language should not be treated as one regimental languages of the soldiers, but in Hungary it's the state language. As I said, the constitution was a bit different in Hungary. So in Hungary was really Hungarian, the state languages, while the others were minority language. While in Austria, it was like it's people's languages. So in fact, the lingua franca used in the ministries was German, but due to the constitution, it was like several languages on equal footing. So the problem is that then this idea of this equal footing and that conscripts have the right to be trained in their language was adopted for the Joint Army also in Hungary. And so the Hungarian politicians claimed, well, that's not based on our constitution. So you're bringing your constitutional right into our language, into our country. Next one, please. In the press before 1914, it was usually between sarcasm and covering existing deficiencies, or both in one image. As just two examples here, which I can't explain because I'm running out of time, but I will share. But this will be recorded, so you can do it on your own. But it's something. It was so in the press, satirics over these grievances and deficiencies. It was on a daily basis, almost that the language diversity was discussed in press. Next one, please. Because this is the Great War Group, so let's go to war. Important is also that soldiers during the service learned other languages and they tended to mix them up. So very often, but this was also a problem for nationalists, that they are destroying the purity of our national treasure, the language. But for the soldiers, it was usually no, it's not a problem at all. And even one of the most famous songs, which was sung all over Austria-Hungary in the garrison, Kanonier Jaburek, was a total mixture of German and Czech words and language. Next one, please. So what is really important also before the war is that when they trained the soldiers, they had the glory of the regiment's training manuals, and also these had to be in the languages of the regiment. So here is one example where they used Czech and German, so both languages. Next slide, please. So language diversity before 1914, it was a daily life phenomenon in every garrison because it was usually mixed. So being not mixed was unusual. And you can see this also when I've also tried to put together slides with different kinds of sources. So this is postcards that were widespread and usually or very often they use more than one language. This is not an expression that they think that this diversity was something positive. of course, also that they printed it, that more soldiers bought one postcard printed. If you only have Czech and solely Hungarian postcards, of course, there is less who buy them, but usually they were, or very often they were multilingual. Next one, please. So what did happen in mobilization in summer 1914? Very interesting is that even if you go to the planning for war in the staff office, that the language diversity was not given high credibility. So it was something they did not really deal with. They said, okay, we will manage that. We also managed that during the maneuvers, so it won't be a problem at all. But during the first days, if you read the diaries and the orders and everything, it's really like this. Everybody wrote like, oh, now we see how language diversity can cause problems. And also Stefan Zweig put it up in his famous novel, The World of Yesterday, the Babelish language confusion caused an additional hardship. And also, not only within Austria-Hungary, but also abroad, because there was a lot of migration from Austria-Hungary to Australia and to the US and to Canada and South America. And when Austrian consulates published the call to arms, they usually had to do this in several languages. This is just one example for Luxembourg. Next one, please. You find lots of autobiographical sources where it really reads like that, and you can read that later on when you have more time. But it's really like you sometimes have the feeling, oh no, now we really recognize the challenge of fighting with such diverse and soldiers and so many languages. So really, it feels like when you read these letters, and it's regardless of the nationality of the officer or the soldier, it's like everybody was just surprised. There were some voices who said, we already said that for 20 years, that you should deal with that more. You should prepare them more, but it's only a few voices. The most who were sent to the different front lines, it was just, oh no. Next slide, please. So I've already said that it's like during the maneuvers, they also wrote then in the first weeks of the war, it was like the war is not comparable at all with how we trained before the war. Next slide, please. So what is really important is that also after a while, many diaries reported that the language diversity, it might have been not that much of a problem when there was really fighting going on because they worked with this command language, or there was someone. But what is really important is that lots of diaries then wrote about that they felt lonely. So when they were dropped somewhere or they ended up at the front line in a company of a different languages, that they wrote about that they felt lonely. There was no one they were able to speak to. So it caused damage on the fighting morale. Next one, please. But what is really important with the fighting morale is also that while the diaries are dealing with that, and also officers are dealing with that, but they fear they will lose the confidence with the soldiers, that they did not report that officially to their to the ministry. So it's something, I don't know why, but they did not report that. What also happened is that very often it caused higher casualties. Is it because of friendly fire? Just one example you also find in diaries and memoirs is when they ended up in no man's land and they heard some Slavic. They were not sure if this is Russians or Poles or own Poles, as they always called them, or the enemy. So very often they were taken prisoner of war just because they thought, oh, it's our Poles, and then too late recognized that it's Russian that they heard. Or when they had to give the password when re-entering their own front line, that that was not their regiment, or it was the Hungarian territorial defense, that they didn't know the word, and so they were shot. This is also something you find in diaries and memoirs, but it's usually not reported to the war ministry. So if you go through these kind of sources, you don't almost never find this. Next one, please. Yeah, and then so also something you should read this on your own later on because I have only 1 minute left. Next one, please. Yeah, what is really important is also with the war correspondence and the censorship. I mean, imagine you have a front line, and every letter and every note back to the homeland has to be censored, and you have all these languages, and one person who has to do the censorship. That there is no person who can read or understand all the languages, which means very soon they invented this, what you can see here, the war correspondence card, which was free of charge, and you were not allowed to add anything there. But they said, like, I'm healthy and I'm fine. So the most important message for the relatives left behind. Next one, please. Pastoral care is just one really important branch, also before the war. So you had to have the right pastoral care at the right time, at the right front, at the right soldier and not only he did not only language diversity played a role, but also that maybe there was a Jewish rabbi who spoke Czech, but this does not mean that the dying soldier was of Jewish was a Jew and also went for Roman Catholics and for everybody else. Next one, please. Yeah, so there were lots of things that were invented. For example, this so-called confessarius polyglottus. So how can a Roman Catholic priest give the last help the soldier, the dying soldier, in his languages? So he had a little handbook. You can also look at that afterwards. Next one, please. Yeah, treating the wounded, the same military doctors, nurses. You always had to provide people with whom the sick soldier or the injured soldier was able to speak. And also these you find in lots of novels, memoirs, and diaries that this was a really big problem for the Austro-Hungarian armies during the First World War. Next one, please. And also the prisoners of war. So it was when you had the prisoners of war, and there were nurses from the Red Cross visiting them. That I mean, it depicts some like Nora Kinsky, who spoke many languages, and she wrote in her diary that very often she was there was only one. There was an officer who spoke only Hungarian, and no one else spoke Hungarian. She was the only one. After a couple of months, he was able to talk with. Next one, please. And it also goes on with commemoration, so how to commemorate. And Giles mentioned my project in Rome. It's like, how do you commemorate that? Usually at these places outside Austria-Hungary, like the battlefields at the Russian front, where you have these graves, how do you commemorate that? Because usually they are in German language, but the soldiers come from all nationalities. Next one, please. Next one, please. Yeah, this is just if you're interested, we are still looking for descendants because there is 450 Austro-Hungarian soldiers buried under this church in Rome, and 219 were unidentified when we started our project, but it was usually, and this is really the long-lasting effect of the language diversity, is a bulk of them were unidentified until the last 2 years when we worked on that. It's because the names, when they died as prisoners of war in Rome, the names were totally misspelled. So Hungarian names, and an Italian hears that. And so this was the reason. But what does this mean? It meant that lots of families from across former Austria-Hungary were never got to know what happened to their son or to their father or to the brother. Next one, please. Yeah, so I'm through. Thank you very much for listening, and we have almost 50 minutes left for a discussion. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Well, thank you, Tamara. That was awesome. And I'm sure we have questions. Bart, you're still recording. Vanda, are you here? Wow. So I had a question. I mean, so from a practical perspective, I mean, what did they do? I mean, did guys just like not be able to eat, or they get the wrong ammunition, or they got, sent to the wrong place, or they got on the wrong train? I mean, it must have been a complete shit show, right? Pardon my French.
Yeah. Very often they reported or wrote down afterwards in their memoirs or diaries that this exactly happened very often. On the other hand, as the front lines became more and more mixed, it's also like the more it's mixed also means that very often you have a higher chance that there is someone around who spoke the other language at least a bit. So yeah, you had this kind of mixture. But the thing is, very often you find it in the memoirs and diaries of German soldiers from the German army, because for them that was totally new. It really, these diaries read like no one told them that Austria-Hungary is not a German language country. So they were totally, they write like, I had to work, they gave me these 3 soldiers to build up the telephone line. And one was a Bosniak who spoke only Bosnian, the other one a Czech who spoke only Czech, and then they ended up with not even these 3 were able to communicate.
Presumably the junior officer losses were as high for the Austro-Hungarian army as they were for other armies. Did that make the problem worse?
Sorry, say it again. I had a problem with the...
Well, assuming you have really high turnover of second lieutenants, for instance, does that make the problem worse? I mean, you got to be constantly training people in languages, and it takes longer to train them than they last.
Yeah, that was really a big problem, because when they started the war, so my initial, there was one slide with this second lieutenant, because usually the second lieutenants are the ones who directly went with their unit to the front line. So in the first couple of weeks, because they were right at the front with their men, they died. So it was the ones who usually knew the command language, they knew the languages of the soldiers. They were all gone immediately. Also, they're older, experienced NCOs. So they had to really be replaced with others who usually were not from peacetime experience with how to maneuver through these languages. And so they had a big problem with that.
I mean, that's just it. It's something you could not simulate in peacetime maneuvers unless you just went out to the field and said every 6th second lieutenant head back to barracks. We're going to have to cope, and and you add to that. I've never thought about the friendly fire aspect as much, but you might have 2 battalions that are aside each other that lose, command and control. They're scared. And all of a sudden they're hearing what sounds like Russian, and it's Slovenian or Slovakian, which are Slavic language. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective.
It's also with information. So there is a really long diary of a young officer who was cavalry first, and because they didn't really need the cavalry at the Russian front any longer, he was used as, go from one part of the front line to the other and collect information, ask the people there. And he said, like, very often he ended up among Hungarians and they were unable to speak. So, and he wrote in his diary, so much information got lost.
Well, nobody speaks Hungarian, though.
But I really like your idea because I never thought of that before during the maneuvers. The most clever thing to do would have been like, okay, let's mix them all up and let's show what's going on and how to cope with that. But I never ever came across that someone came up with this idea. But it's clever.
Corey, you have a question? You need to unmute.
Oh, yeah, there we go. In the list of languages, I thought I was under the impression some of those languages use a Cyrillic alphabet. So did they have to actually print in addition to the language barrier, do they have to actually print things in different alphabets also?
Yeah, yeah. So, like the postcard I showed, this I'm well and I'm fine postcard. So usually they also use for Serbian and for Ruthenian, they use the Cyrillic alphabet. So Cyrillic was always in. Yeah, and for the Jewish rabbi, they also had, of course, like Hebrew in. So that's the third script.
With like, I was in the Czech Republic for a while, and at that period of time, anybody in the officer class would have been fluent in German. And if they're of Czech ancestry, then they would have been fluent in Czech probably at that point. 80 years earlier, not, or 60 years earlier, not. But so again, the multilingual amongst the officer class is not as big an issue until you get if you come from a Czech ancestry, you might be able to pick up on Serbo-Croatian fairly. It's not going to be completely alien. Serbian would be because of the alphabet.
Yeah, I mean, of course you have it easier if you spoke a Slavic language. I mean, I learned Croatian, so I'm not totally lost in the Czech Republic or in Slovenia. I mean, I'm not. So the basic things you might get, and it's easier for me if I'm spending like in December 2 weeks in Slovenia. I then get into that, what they say differently, where is the different words, and then it's no problem at all. But I think during the war, with these young officers who are experienced with that, but who died immediately in the first weeks, because you had this tradition of that young officers really go into the first line in advance with their soldiers, so they were all shot, and also the NCO. So afterwards they said, like, please stay in the back, not go during the advancement and join your soldiers. So they also changed fighting tactics after a while because they needed them, but they all had to be replaced with reserve officers. What does this mean? Reserve officers only spent a year. They were also called 1 year volunteers. They all spent only 1 year. So they were military, not that trained. They were not trained with the system, and they usually spoke only German or Czech because the young reserve officers, they dropped the requirement for reserve officers like at the turn of the century, that they were no longer requested to speak German. So there was Czechs becoming reserve officers, or Slovenes who spoke only Slovene. So it was them who then really had to fight the war, and not the experience. And the really multilingual officers, so those who experienced lots of garrisons, I mean, there were the higher ranks, and the higher ranks you will rarely find at the front line. So for them, those who spoke the main languages were not the ones like at the front line.
For some reason, I'm thinking of U.S. 77th, which was a draftee division from New York that had about 24 languages spoke as first language.
Wow.
Just a lot of immigrants. So there are parallels. Yeah, the English, we were talking in Brighton, and there was the parallels with the English and having guys from Wales that couldn't communicate with the people from London, I guess, or something.
Yeah, it's like with me with the Tyroleans. Or even worse, Vorarlberg. So that's a part usually people from Eastern Austria have never been so far. I went there once, and it's like you're in a different country.
Well, thank you, Tamara. That was absolutely tremendous. Any more questions? We have a minute left before we'll probably get chewed out of here.
Well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara.